研讨会主持人，我们政治大学郑教授、台师大陈院长、高师大杨院长、政大陈副院长、东华大学李教授以及各位贵宾、媒体朋友，大家好。实验教育3法从2014年底通过到现在，已经上路了7年。在110学年度，共有114所学校来进行实验教育，参与实验教育的学生更已经超过了2万人。在少子女化的趋势下，实验教育仍逐年的成长跟发展，可见社会各界对实验教育的高度重视跟期盼。为了要持续深化实验教育的理论跟实务模式，教育部委托了政治大学实验教育推动中心办理实验教育国际的研讨会。回顾历年研讨会中讨论的丰富成果，不仅成为实验教育推动的重要动力，也透过共同的教育理念，让体制内外的学校也有了更多的对话跟互动。今年研讨会已经来到了第5届。今年研讨会的主题是疫情挑战下的实验教育与乡村教育。除了邀请我国实验教育相关学者专家、教育工作者外，也特别邀请了3位来自美国跟加拿大的国际学者，透过视讯连线进行学术的交流以及实际实务案例的分享。一方面是回顾实验教育及偏乡教育在疫情期间所面临的挑战跟问题，另外一方面也参考其他国家的实际经验，相信借由国内外众多的教育工作者的经验跟智慧，对于未来的实验教育的推动跟创新，一定有更多新的可能。教育部也会持续陪伴支持实验教育学校与教育伙伴们，创造共同的教育环境。台湾的实验教育3法为亚洲第一，而接下来这条实验教育的路，教育部会与各位一起努力，一起前进。我要再次向所有的教育伙伴致上最深的感谢，也预祝研讨会顺利的举行。谢谢大家。
2021年实验教育第5届国际研讨会正式开始。从早上的9点到9点40，这个场次呢，会是我们的国外讲者 Jonathan 来跟大家分享。那现在呢，就先让我隆重的邀请来自国立政治大学教育学院陈荣政副院长荣政老师来为大家揭开这个国际研讨会的序曲。请大家在聊天的地方来点掌声，谢谢，欢迎荣政老师。
好，谢谢。谢谢各位非常早起的对于实验教育有兴趣的各位好朋友们。主持人我们郑腾辽郑教授，我们在线上各位好朋友们，还有各位也许可能在荧幕上看到我们远在美国，待会为我们做主题演讲的宾州大学的Jonathan Supovitz 教授。Jonah, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you well. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I have to introduce it in Mandarin. So we have a spontaneous translation, and
Yes, I'm listening.
Turn to my Mandarin track, but I think our interpreter will do his job well. Okay. 各位，我先在开始之前，先跟各位介绍我们今天主题讲者Jonathan Supovitz。Professor Supovitz 他目前是在美国宾州大学担任教授的工作。他目前负责一个全美国性的一个教育政策的一个研究团体。那里面的成员包含了哈佛大学、密西根大学、斯坦福大学、哥伦比亚大学非常好的学校的教育学院。那我们这次请那个 Supovitz 教授来，最主要是希望可以借由他在疫情爆发期间，对于全美国学校怎么去因应疫情开始对学校的冲击之后，他们可能会有的或者已经采取的一些措施。那他们有非常坚强的研究团队，也因为这样子一个非常丰硕的研究成果，所以我们特别拜托他在今天 这样的一个场合来跟我们做个分享。现在是美东时间晚上的8点钟，我们特别请他牺牲他的休息时间来跟我们做个连线，所以我们大概会有40分钟时间，请我们的讲座教授来对我们做一个讲述跟分享。那会后我们大概会有15到20分钟，也请我们与会的好朋友们，你可以透过我们在线上留言，或者您在现场，你可以用中文发问没有问题，因为我们线上同时有同步的翻译，他可以知道你所问的问题。好，那我们是不是就在荧幕上用我们最热情的方式来欢迎我们那个 Supovitz 教授
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen with you. And let's see, here we go. And can I just get some thumbs up to see that people can see my screen and hear my voice? And
Yes.
yes, I'm
Excellent.
hearing that. So everything is good. That's excellent. So good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you about some of the experiences in the United States around COVID-19. I know it's been a very trying time for everybody, really, but particularly for people, for educators in the US and internationally. And today I'm going to talk to you about a study that we've done, which we're calling a COVID stress test for schools. And I'll explain that title in just a second. But let me start out by, just pointing out that this is really an unprecedented event, and I'm sure this occurred in Taiwan too, but never before has every school in a country closed down around the same time. And so for us, it was on Friday, March 13th in 2000, when virtually every school in the country closed its doors due to the coronavirus pandemic. And my colleagues and I launched an investigation to investigate how schools and school systems responded to this unprecedented test and what factors contributed to their responses. The title of my talk today comes from a very wise school leader in Montana who actually is an American Indian. And when we talked to him, he said, was education prepared for a stress test like this? As professionals, we provided something at the end of the day, but was it enough? That's the question we're going to have to look at in the years to come. As a district or a state or a country, what did we really do? And so this principle talked about the challenge that they faced as a stress test, and that's why our title is As a Stress Test in Education. So let me see. So before I start, let me just describe to you a few things about the American education system that I think are really important for you to understand. So first of all, the US has a very decentralized education system, and we have semi-autonomous layers of national, state, and local education agencies. And the funding, likewise, comes from a combination of national funding, state funding, and local funding. Local funding is largely through property taxes. And this produces lots of variation, funding differences across the United States and in different communities. And the national funding is largely to equalize funding disparities across different localities and across different states. So national funding is largely for equity purposes. And although we've had a national movement towards standards, education is very local in the US. And so standards, accountability, and support systems are all localized in the US. And that's going to be a theme that comes out in the variation of school responses, because a lot of it has to do with different opportunities that and different resources that existed across the system. One more thing to give you a sense of is a sense of Taiwan relative to the US. Very interesting. I looked this up in preparation for this talk, and Taiwan is the size of one of our smaller states, and I'm using Vermont, which is up here in the east. And so Vermont and Taiwan are roughly the same size in terms of square miles or square kilometers, but Taiwan has the population of our third most populous state, which is Florida. So although Taiwan is very small, its population density is very high relative to many states in the United States. So a small state or a small country relative to our states, but very populous, and as populous as our third most populous state in the US. So this gives you a sense of how Taiwan is relative to the United States. So let me start my talk by talking about what we are calling the Leading in Crisis study. And this was an examination of school responses in the early stages of the pandemic. And our study was really a study of opportunity. As I mentioned, the coronavirus hit in March of 2020, and I brought together 18 of my colleagues from around the United States within a month, and we started to interview school leaders about their initial responses. So I call this a crowdsourced study, in the sense that we were really taking advantage of our existing relationship with school leaders to try and understand school responses at the very, very beginning of the coronavirus epidemic. And so in that first several months, from mid-April to mid-August of 2020, we interviewed over 120 school leaders, and our interviews focused on 3 phases. The first phase was those critical few weeks when schools were closing, and what were the most pressing issues that leaders faced, and what was the extent of guidance that they got and support that they got from their districts and their states. The second phase was what we called the settling in phase, as they transitioned to online teaching. And so how did they organize for online teaching? What were the experiences of students, families, and teachers? How did they collaborate and make decisions? And another thing that was very important for our study, which I won't talk about much today, but was how leaders managed their stress and how they supported the well-being and mental health of their faculties, of their families, and of their students. And then we also asked them, what did they see coming next? So I want to sort of situate us a little bit more here. By the way, this is just a layout of the diversity of representation in our sample. So we had 120 school leaders responding to an interview. They came from 71 districts in the United States and across 19 states. And this was not intended at all to be a representative sample, but I'm going to show you some of the descriptive statistics in a second. And you can see that our sample was in many ways similar to a national cross-section of responses. So this is a sense of our sample relative to the nation at large. And the blue in this chart is our sample, and the red is our national demographics. So you can see, for example, that our principals averaged 8 years of experience. Nationally, they averaged 7 years of experience. You can see that the ethnic breakdown of our principals were a little bit more diverse than the national sample. We had fewer white principals and a greater proportion of Black principals, for example. Our grade ranges in our study were fairly similar to a national distribution. We have something called a poverty indicator in the US, which is the extent to which kids get assistance to purchase lunch in school. And nationally, about half the students get some kind of support to get lunch in school. And in our sample, very similar proportion of kids got lunch assistance. On the right here is the breakdown of student ethnicity. Very similar. In our study, we had about 48% of the schools were a majority white schools. In our sample, about 19% were majority Hispanic versus national, about 27%. So our sample wasn't too far off from the national distribution, although our sample was not designed as a representative sample. But it came out to look fairly similar to what the distribution of schools looks like across the country. So to guide our study, we wanted to know what prior research has said about how organizations should respond to crises. And so this lays the groundwork for our investigation. So what do we know from the research on crisis management that will help us to understand and make sense of how the schools in our study responded to the coronavirus pandemic? And the first thing that we looked at was there's a typology about different kinds of crises. And so, for example, there are in the literature short-term crises which suddenly arrive and are quickly concluded. There are crises that have slow buildups and then they reach a critical point and they're quickly resolved. There are long-term crises that move slowly and then they continue for a long period of time without any clear resolution. There are single event crises, and then there are things, interestingly enough, in this typology called infectious crises. And I don't think this was intended to think about a virus infection, but these are infectious crises which occur quickly, are seemingly resolved, but they leave other issues which develop their own crises. And so this is kind of a multiple iteration of crises. And what we decided was that the COVID-19 crisis really for schools had multiple waves, and you could think of the initial wave, and then you could think of the Delta variant, and now we're moving into the Omicron variant. But you can think of these waves of crisis where each one is distinct in and of itself, and these represent school semesters, and that in my depiction here, they're slightly less severe, excuse me, they're slightly less severe as they move over time because we learn things from the previous incarnations and we incorporate those into our responses. But I want to say that our study focuses on this initial outbreak of COVID-19, where we quickly mobilized to get principal response understandings of their schools and how their schools reacted to the sudden outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis. The literature also talks about 5 different areas, which is pre-planning, organizational capacity, leadership, communication, and the extent to which schools are faced with adverse situations. I'm sure in Taiwan, certain areas were hit more severely with the coronavirus than others, and that was similar in the United States, right? So in some places, the presence of coronavirus was not particularly ubiquitous, but in other areas, it was very, very present. So in the literature, they talk about the importance of planning for crisis and having some kind of system in place to avoid some kind of when a crisis hits. In the literature, they talk about how organizations have systems that help them to manage materials and resources, their technology systems, their organizational culture, their human and social capacities, and their collaboration that helps them to respond to crises. So organizations have resilient capacities that help them to respond to crises. Leadership is very important in crisis, and so in crisis leadership, leaders have the ability to adapt and to change their models and to respond to unfamiliar situations. And so a very important aspect of leadership response to crisis is it's called adaptive leadership, which emphasizes open-mindedness and flexibility and ability to adapt to a very different kind of environment. Communication is also a very important thing. In schools, there are both internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. So you can think of faculty and staff as being internal stakeholders, and you can think of parents and community organizations and the public at large as external constituents. And so successful communication involves quick, accurate, and direct and candid information, very challenging in a quickly changing environment. And last but not least, the literature talks about different communities having different advantages and disadvantages which help them to respond or not to a crisis. So these 5 areas became very important because we organized our analyses around these 5 areas. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So the framework that we use, and remember down here in the corner, we're talking about the very first outbreak of the coronavirus, even though there have been successive waves of the pandemic as we move forward. So ours was situated in the very beginning. And so the model or the framework that we used to make sense of school responses was this. And let me explain this for a second. So this comes from from these authors who developed a similar framework which we adapted for this situation. And the red dotted line here depicts the initiation of the pandemic crisis, which unfolded over time, which is this red arrow to the right. And that initially there was that initial shock and adjustment. And so the first couple of weeks, schools were trying to figure out how to respond to this situation. That turned out to be very critical, as I'll explain in a minute. And then there was an adjustment phase as they transitioned to online instruction. And in this model, the authors talk about 3 types of pathways that schools could take. This first pathway is they depicted as organizations, in our case schools, being vulnerable. And a vulnerable organization or school really continued to be vulnerable and was persistently dysfunctional. And I'll describe what that meant in a second. Virtually every other organization or school went through some kind of what is called here transient flux. And so as they were trying to figure out how to respond, they went through a transitional period as they adjusted, and they took one of 4 pathways. Either they went through this period of flux and they developed essentially they returned to functioning as a school, but at a very minimal level. We have examples of this in our data. There were other schools that returned to kind of a stable level of functioning. And then there were a set of schools which actually innovated as they returned. They figured out how to solve some of their problems with innovative approaches. I'll talk about some of those in a second. And then there were a small sample of schools that returned with high innovation. And again, this gray box on the right is meant to depict the fact that I'm only focused on this first wave in the spring of 2020, but there was another transition in the fall of 2020. And then this last pathway of response of schools, interestingly, these authors labeled this as resistance, and they didn't mean that schools resisted the coronavirus. What it means is that they basically were in such a situation that they were able to essentially return quickly to their functioning. Although it was online, they were able to essentially resist the transient flux and quickly return to a state of functioning in a modified state. So you can see that I've labeled these 1, 2, 3, 4 is down here, quick return, 5 and 6, because these essentially are different pathways that schools could take in their responses to the coronavirus pandemic. And based on the literature, I've added these 5 areas of the literature to this model to think about how pre-planning influenced schools' responses, how their organizational capacity influenced the pathway that they took to returning to instruction, their leadership, how that influenced their return to instruction, their communication and how that influenced their return to online instruction, and then this slope here I've depicted as the degree of adversity, because some schools had much more headwinds or much more barriers in their way in their ability to return to whatever instructional state that they achieved in the spring of 2020. And so what I want to do is use this model to give you examples of schools in our sample and how they responded to the pandemic using this model as my organizing heuristic. So now I'm going to describe what we learned. So first of all, I want to talk about the distribution. We had 120 schools, and we basically coded their descriptions of their responses to assess on this 6-point scale the degree to which they returned to instruction and the extent to which they innovated in the process. And in our data, this is the distribution of responses. I want to describe to you what these schools looked like a little bit. So we had 10 schools that were of our 120, which essentially never got back to instruction, 14 schools that had a low return to functioning, etc. So let me describe a little bit more of what that looked like. So this table shows these 120 schools and the distribution of them. And let me describe what these 6 categories mean. So there were about 8% of our schools which never got back to instruction. They closed and they were never able to return to even providing online activities to their students. Very sad. There were about 11% of the schools which went through what I called transient flux before, but they went through a delay, and they returned to instruction for some students with review only, but no new learning. So they basically said, we're only going to review the material we've already covered, and we're not going to introduce any new material to students. We had the largest bulk of our schools, about 30%, return to functioning after delay, And after some time, they did a lot of review, but they were able to continue with the curriculum and introduce new learning for most, but not all students. The schools that were quickly returning to their to online instruction largely had very good technology in place. And so they had one-to-one computers that they had already given out to students. They were, all students had laptops and were used to engaging with school in online environments or with technology. And so they were able to quickly return to functioning with little or minimal delays. There were about 16% of our sample, 19 schools, that made some adjustments in instructional content and delivery to meet the emerging needs of students. And so this could be examples of how they quickly adapted new technology platforms, how they created instructional materials that allowed them to meet students' needs. They were very flexible about when school was located, when school was occurring, so that they expanded the school day. Some teachers went to evening instruction. And so these are some examples of some of the innovations they had to meet the emerging needs of their students. And then 15 of our schools, or 12.5%, were very innovative in either the ways that they delivered instruction or the content that they provided to meet the differing needs of students. And so this shows you the distribution of responses that schools had as they got back to trying to return to school after a couple of weeks after the outbreak. So now what I want to do is to go back to my model. Let me just go back here for a second. To go back to my model and to talk about these 5 areas: extent of pre-planning, organizational capacity, leadership, communication, and degree of adversity, which can help us to understand the pathways that schools took and how they got to these different states of functioning in the spring after the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. So the first finding that I want to say is that in the literature, they talk about pre-planning and being ready for a crisis, but this was really, there were virtually no schools that had any kind of, that were ready in any kind of ways for the coronavirus response. So it turned out that pre-planning really occurred in their ability to mobilize in that first week after the coronavirus hit. And it was pretty, I was just talking to some colleagues about this the other day. There were a lot of people in our interviews who said, we expected to come back to school after a week after when they sent us home. And so we thought that we'd be out for a week and then we'd come back. Well, here we are almost 2 years later, and we're still not back to fully functioning. So there was an unrealistic sense of how this crisis was going to be really a long-term situation. So no principles in our study described any kind of pre-planning, but the how schools responded in that first week was crucial to their ability to be effective in their responses. And those who were most effective really took advantage of that first week or 10 days of response. On the right here in purple, I have some quotes from principals and the ratings of their schools on our 6-point scale. So, you know, for example, a New Jersey elementary principal said, it wasn't a complete shock because we were beginning to prepare for it. We had a sense that this was going to happen. and that school got rated a 5. Whereas by contrast, a Texas principal said we only expected to be out for a week, so no one even brought things home from school. And that school returned after the period of flux. And then a Pennsylvania principal who I interviewed said that the first week we heard hardly anything from the district, so there wasn't any guidance about what to do or what to say to teachers, parents, or students. It was almost complete radio silence. And that unfortunately was a school that never got back to opening in the spring. So pre-planning was uncommon in schools, but how schools spent that first week was crucial to their responses. The second finding was how schools use their organizational capacity that helped them to respond. So those with technology naturally had more resources to respond. Schools and school systems which were effective identified and made use of people with special skills. So curriculum experts, technology folks, people who had experience with video, people who had experience with teacher training. They essentially reorganized their systems to build the system's capacity in each of these areas, and that really helped them to respond. And then a third area, which was really important, was existing social networks amongst principals, amongst teachers, amongst district leaders, really help to spread ideas and resources within systems and across systems. So some quotes to illustrate this. A California high school principal said, our school had invested in laptops for students, so we didn't even have to distribute technology, and this made our job that much easier. A Delaware elementary principal whose school we rated a 5, returning with some innovation, said, our central office staff put together videos and did tutorials for teachers about how to use online software platforms, and that really helped our teachers to transition to online teaching. And a Tennessee elementary principal whose school we rated a return to functioning, said we had a strong network of principals in our district and we were constantly sharing information with each other. So these quotes illustrate how schools and systems that had an effective use of their existing organizational capacity really facilitated schools' return to functioning. I agree. Very interesting. In terms of leadership, I think that what we saw was that leaders that balanced decision-making in their own decision-making and giving faculty autonomy to respond to the needs of their students really responded much more effectively. So I'll just read the bullets over here. On the left-hand side, and flexible leaders were frustrated by the constantly changing dynamics. And this was a system that was, a situation where there was a lot unknown and information was changing constantly. And so they really had to be flexible. But leaders in schools with strong responses balance clear guidance with flexibility to make situational adjustments, which turned out to be very important. I'm a little bit behind on time here, so I'm not going to read these quotes. The slides will be available to folks, and we can have, if they are translated or if you can read English, you can read these quotes from principals. The fourth finding is around communication, and communication was important in two ways. One was internal communication to the school community, and the second important communication was external communication to parents, to the public, and to other community members. So clear communication in our study was very challenging for schools because of the constantly changing situation. There were lots of examples of both over-communication, and over-communication was a problem because people were being inundated with messages from lots of different folks. So that's over-communication. Or under-communication, not having enough information. So trying to find that balance between sending an appropriate amount of information, but not overwhelming people with lots of information. So effective leaders facilitated the information flow rather than trying to control the messaging. And so, for example, this Colorado principal said our district sent an email every Friday to parents, which created a consistent flow of communication about the latest information. Whereas this Pennsylvania principal said that we were getting a flood of messages from the district supervisors, which were contradicting each other, and we had to ask them to actually send us fewer communications because they were confusing to us. So that's my fourth. Now, the fifth thing that I want to talk about before I wrap up here is the degree of adversity. And I'm going to represent this a little bit different. I'm going to represent this with a statistical model, a regression model. So this is a regression which tried to use different independent variables to predict the school ratings. Remember, we have 6 school ratings, and we tried to predict those with a series of indicators of disadvantage. So one was whether food distribution was a major activity of schools. And so in the US, many schools are a source of really nutrition for kids. And so schools provide breakfast and they provide lunch to students. And this is very important so that when they switch to online, they have to figure out how to distribute food to families. And so what this says is that for schools where food distribution was a pressing issue, they had a significantly lower rating in their response. And likewise, I'll flop down to this third one here. In schools where the area had many of the houses in the area of the school did not have internet access, where there was a higher proportion of houses without internet access, quite naturally, those schools got a lower rating because students had difficulty getting access to materials and being able to go online. And we also have an indicator of poverty in our school system where, which is lunch assistance, which I mentioned earlier, and schools that had higher levels of lunch assistance responded, had lower school ratings, so responded less positively. And then this one over here is interesting because, as I mentioned before, different places in the US had different exposures to COVID. So this is an indicator about the amount of COVID in your in the school area at the time of the study. And actually, where there was more prevalence of COVID, schools actually responded more effectively, and they had higher response ratings. And so I take that to mean that there was more urgency in those areas. And therefore, when COVID was present in your school community, you had more urgency, and therefore you responded more effectively. And below here are the relationship between school characteristics and school ratings. And very quickly, Elementary schools didn't respond significantly different than high schools. Larger schools responded more effectively than smaller schools. Urban schools responded more, had higher ratings than suburban schools, and there was no difference between rural schools and suburban schools in their response to in their return to instructional functioning, which was our school rating. So just to sum things up, this is the summary of the findings of our study, where pre-planning was uncommon for schools, but how they spent that first week was crucial in their responses. That using your organizational resources, your human capacity, your social capacity, and your physical resources help schools to facilitate their responses. Effective leaders balance centralized decision-making and local autonomy. Communication was very important, and you had to find a balance between not over-communicating and not under-communicating. And that schools that faced more disadvantage had lower school responses. So that's the last point for me. This was a study of a COVID stress test for schools. And I will now, by the way, if you want we have a number of policy briefs on this topic, and here's a website that you can go to if you're interested in reading about these different topics. But now I look forward to opening up for questions.
好，谢谢 Supovitz 教授，刚刚非常详细而且精彩，富有科学证据的对于全美主要地方的一些对学校领导，还有针对我们这疫情期间的一个因应，他特别提到在危机管理这一块，那用了不同的模式来做一些解释，我相信现场有学校的校长。也有在用自己的方式来进行教育的教育同好，我不知道各位对于刚刚的主题演讲，各位有没有其他进一步的一些提问？我们都可以透过这个时间，一起来跟我们的主题讲者来做一个互动。现场有没有？
Trial version.
没有的话，我想先请教我们的 Supovitz 教
Trial
授。
version.
不知道我们刚刚所提到的，在学校里面的领导的部分，在公立学校的学校，还有在私立的学校，在做危机的管理这一块，有没有不同的地方？因为刚刚看到这不同的分类，好像没有就公立跟私立去做一个说明。那另外一点想请教，也是我相信在座很多的观众比较感兴趣，就是那些被列为不会再回来的，不会再有任何功能的学校，关掉的学校，他们后来那些学生，都何去何从？大概是我的2个问题请教，谢谢。
So let me, I should have mentioned this before. When we were designing our study, we made a conscious decision early on to just focus on public schools. So we did not include private schools in this study, and we did not include charter schools in this study. In the US, we have things called charter schools, which are, they're relieved of some of the constraints of public schools. And so we decided, given the fact that we had very little time and we wanted to capture people's experiences as close to the event as possible, that we decided we didn't want to dilute our sample, and we had to make a decision about what to focus on. So we just focused on public schools. So unfortunately, I can't speak to private schools. For those schools that were persistently dysfunctional, here's an example of what happened in probably a handful of those we labeled as persistently dysfunctional. So the district leaders made a decision that students would not be, that whatever grades that they had before the coronavirus pandemic started, that the students would have the same grades through the end of the year. And I think this was a mistake for those schools because they essentially reduced the incentive of students to come to school. And so or to go online. So basically, if I'm a high school student and I realize that it doesn't, that if I come or I don't come, I'm going to get the same grade at the end of the year, then I have no incentive to attend school. So that's an example of a persistently dysfunctional school where the leaders made decisions not to create incentives for students to continue to attend. In those cases, those students in many of those situations, they were working during the pandemic, and there was a lot of need and a lot of opportunity for students to become what were called essential workers, where they could work in supermarkets, or they could work in food delivery, or they could work in a lot of different in a lot of different jobs. And so in some of those persistently dysfunctional schools, they were high schools where the students took the opportunity and the school didn't have any kind of incentive to keep them attending.
好，谢谢。我们线上现在有非常多的问题进来要请教我们的主题讲者，但是因为时间的关系，我大概只能再挑2题，来请教我们的主题讲者。那其中一题是有关于学校危机领导里面的沟通，那里面有提到校内的过度沟通，那在这一块是不是请教授再深入的做说明？那另外一题是，请问如何去区分在学校回应方式这6个部分当中的第5个部分、第6个部分，也就是恢复一些创新，还有恢复高度的创新。大概就这2个问题，可不可以请我们的主题讲者帮我们再做一个说明？谢谢。
So let me give some examples of over communication. So in some school systems, or in all school systems, there are different subject matter heads. So think about department chairs, or think about curriculum supervisors, or think about special education and all the different areas of education. So we could think about math and literacy and science and all the subject areas, and we could think about somebody who's in charge of parent outreach. And so if each one of those people is taking it upon themselves to individually communicate with everybody who they have relevant information for, then I, as a parent, might be receiving 6 or 7 different communications a day from different people. And if nobody is coordinating those communications, then it could be very confusing to me. So some of the examples of over communication just meant that people were taking it upon themselves because of their role within the school system to communicate to all of the either faculty members of schools or to parents and community members. And if there was no coordination of those communications, you could quickly imagine that people were inundated without knowledge that their colleagues were sending messages as well. So this is a good example of where if nobody is overseeing the communication and regulating the flow of messaging, then as a teacher or as a parent, I could be getting 6 or 7 different messages from different aspects of the system without anybody realizing that all these messages are going out, you know, at different times during the day. So that's an example of over communication. Now on the flip side, just to add to the communication issue, on the flip side, communication was very tricky because the federal government, our medical establishment, they constantly had guidelines for how schools should respond to the coronavirus, particularly in those early weeks and months. And those were changing as they got more information. So those communications were being sent to school systems to send out to parents. And if one week I hear that I should be careful about the way that transmission occurs, and then new information comes along and that conflicts with the previous information, that can undermine the credibility of the authority of the school leaders to be giving accurate information. So I think that schools were kind of caught in the middle of so much information that was in an unknown situation. And as a leader, what you're trying to do is you're trying to provide stable and reliable information, and having to frequently change the information reduces your credibility. So, so I think that communication was a very difficult challenge for schools, but trying to find this balance between being authoritative and reliable and consistent with your messaging without having messages come from all kinds of different corners of the school system was very important. So now let me turn to some innovation and high innovation. And I have to say that the way that we made these judgments was we had a set of graduate students who would read the entire transcripts. We recorded these interviews that we did with principals, and we had students who we trained to read and code the transcripts and to make a holistic judgment about what category the school response was. So an example of high innovation would be where there were innovative practices that were developed and provided across the system. And so an example might be, a good example is a New Jersey school where the district leaders decided that initially they were going to organize curricular materials for the entire elementary, middle, and high school systems, or the elementary, middle, and high schools inside of their system. They were going to organize the curriculum for the first 2 weeks. And then after those 2 weeks, they trained a set of teachers to start to develop online materials for their schools. So they helped to organize the teachers to do the adjusting of materials, of curriculum and activities and what homework would be for the entire school. And then all the while they were training teachers so that they could take over this responsibility for their own students. So essentially the system was doing these tasks initially while they were building capacity of teachers across the system to take over this responsibility. So that was a coherent system response where they created and where they innovated about how they were going to make adjustments to their instructional systems as they proceeded throughout the weeks of the pandemic. So that would be a school that would be that would be a school that would be rated a 6 because the system responded and helped them to migrate towards a holistic response. Now, a school with some innovation might be where it was left to local teachers to make decisions about how to instruct their kids, and some teachers helped other teachers, and in some subject areas they were able to innovate, but it was uneven. So there were responses that were highly adjustive to the environment, but those adjustments and those innovations were uneven. And so they affected some grade levels, but not other grade levels. And they affected some teachers, but not other teachers. And so there were I would say there were pockets of innovation, but it wasn't uniform across the system. And that's how we distinguished between some innovation and high innovation.
OK， 好，谢谢。我们在最后一个问题请教，今天这个会场的最后一个问题，这边有一位好朋友他提到说，学校里面的疫苗注射率跟学校里面的危机处理，就是这一次的疫情的危机，有没有什么样子的关系？就您的观察。
我们还有1分钟的时间，所以可能要稍微简短回答这样。
好。
I'll be quick on my response because we only have 1 more minute.
All right, you can take your time. Yeah, you have the privilege.
Okay, I appreciate that. I didn't have, well, because actually it's an easy question to answer because in the spring of 2020, when we were doing our study, there were no vaccines. Right? So at this stage, there were no vaccines. We had an indicator of the extent of the outbreak in the community, and that was definitely inversely related to school response. So the more COVID outbreak that you had, actually, I'm sorry, it was positively related. So the more COVID outbreak that you had in your community, that was correlated with higher school responses. I interpret that as saying that when you have a high incidence of COVID in your community, you have a feeling of urgency. And that urgency spurred schools to have stronger responses. So there were no vaccines at that time, but there was variation in the degree of COVID that existed in communities, and those communities that had higher incidences of COVID had stronger school responses.
好，谢谢。谢谢我们 Supovitz 教授今天早上在美东的晚上，对我们带来的非常具有启发性的演讲。我们不知道有没有注意到，我们 Supovitz 教授他特别把他讲话的速度放慢了2倍。换言之，如果按照变成平常的速度的话，我们应该今天所听到的内容应该乘以2才对。所以特别谢谢他今天晚上的分享。如果各位有兴趣的话，其实可以去上他们这个网站 CPRE Consortium for Policy Research in Education。我觉得可以在里面看到相当多对于关于教育的政策，那学校里面实际的发展，还有组织的一些改变， 非常可以启发人做一些不同些想法的一些研究在里头。我们是不是掌声再用我们的镜头上面各式各样的符号来谢谢我们精彩的演讲，谢谢我们教授，谢谢。Thank you, Jonah. Jonah Free.
好的，谢谢我们的2位教授。然后刚刚很多朋友很厉害哦，你们已经发现下面有个表情符号。如果你觉得刚刚演讲真的是超棒的，而且我们在台湾这么幸福，可以听到国外的这些办学经验，你可以用那个表情符号给我们一些支持哦。好，那在这谢荣正老师的主持。那现在的时间是10点03分，也就是我们的第1次中场休息时间。那我们会休息到10点20。请各位朋友们，大家可以去上个厕所或是活动一下，因为我们今天下午还有非常充实且精彩的讲座。